So good evening, my dear friends. It's so great to see so many of you tonight here. How elating it is. Each one of you is it's unbelievable to think about it this way. But each one of you is worth 100. That's why it looks that we have so many. Tonight we are going to deal with the second commandment, and perhaps even the third commandment. The second commandment. Remember, we have started to study in depth somehow the 10 commandments. And we have discussed last week and previous weeks the first commandment as it is the foundation, the commandment for belief, to believe in God. And last lecture was describing to us 10 ways how to attain, how to be full of emunah, of belief. What do we do in order to believe in God? Is it enough that what we feel, yes, I believe there is a God? You'll be surprised that it's not enough, because this is only something that people are usually fragile in their mind, and that's the reason why they say they believe. But when the time of test arrives, they believe in their boss much more than they believe in God himself. So what do we do in order to fulfill and observe the greatest of all commandments? The first commandment, which is the commandment of emunah, that we have to believe that our God is the God who liberated us from Egypt. So we have listed last week 10 ways, 10 foundations, which are the basis, that can be the basis of acquiring a good amount of emunah in Hashem. If you remember, I'm not going to repeat everything, because that would be repeating the last lecture. Just to remind you, for example, to practice the mitzvot, each mitzvah contributes to your emunah. We mentioned also the idea of from time to time looking and pondering at nature to see the great things that are created in nature. Like it says that by the prophet Yeshaya, Se'u enechem ur'u, just lift your eyes and see who created all this. And then we said also it's possible that from your own body, by watching how your body performs, you will acquire a tremendous amount of emunah. Like Job said, from my own flesh, mi besari echeze Eloah, from my own flesh I can see God. Which means when he sees how the body performs, you know that it's beyond the genius, the greatest genius of all scientists. Also, we said that by learning the history of the Jewish people, from Avraham until the sortie from Egypt, and then how we got Chag Pesach, and the fact that we still celebrate Pesach by reading the Haggadah, the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So from there, it's not too hard to believe. If we still celebrate Pesach the same way they celebrated it for the last 3,000 years, so once you know that there was such a thing as the great miracle of the liberation of the Jews from Egypt, that you know from there to know that immediately after that there was the standing before at the mountain of Sinai when God himself came and gave us the Torah. That's another thing that will help us to believe. But we concluded by saying that there is one fundamental principle and precept that definitely for the thinker, for a natural philosopher, you could practically always help yourself in more believing and more believing in God just by pondering at the day of Shabbat. When Shabbat is once a week, every once a week, we have the opportunity to discover more and more about the existence and the presence of God. Of course, it will take a lot of explanation to show you how, when we are in the midst of Shabbat, how do we realize that God is much more clearer than any other day during the week? Number one, your own logic will tell you that come Shabbat, everything comes to an end. What makes people stop from working, from making money, just because one day a week it arrived and you stop? That's a miracle. But then that's nothing compared to the fact to how you feel on Shabbat. How people look. How do they look like? The light, the special light on every face. Now, it's not easy to sell this kind of theory if you are not into it. You have to be Shomer Shabbat par excellence in order to even understand a little what I am referring at by saying that on Shabbat people's face is different. The way they look is different. The way they speak, the way they talk is different. Even animals, we shall discuss this again when we come to the fourth commandment, which is the commandment of remember Shabbat to sanctify it. Zachor et Shabbat. So when you look upon Shabbat arriving upon us once a week, you know that there is a God. If there was no God, how is it possible to conceive in our mind that people have agreed that once a week, the seventh day, especially the seventh day, the Sabbath day, every Jew who is aware of the commandment of resting on Shabbat comes to a total halt. And then the manifestation of the occurrences that happen on Shabbat for a person who, of course, who perceives that. If you look in some kind of depth, not to be a person who is just a passive one. You have to look upon things with interest. See what's different between the day of Shabbat and the other days. And that will greatly contribute to your emunah in Hashem. So now, as we said, we are going to learn the second commandment. What is the second commandment? Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai. Lo ta'aseh lecha pesel bechol temuna asher bashamayim mima'al ve'al haaretz va'asher ba'aretz mitachat va'asher b'mayim mitachat la'aretz. It's the longest commandment. But the most important part of this commandment is the first verse that says, Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai, which means you shall not recognize the gods of others in my presence. God says, in my presence, you should not refer to any other God. You should not have any other God in my presence. So we have to understand what is this. Of course we understand why it is a second commandment. Because the first commandment is telling us to believe in God, the God who liberated us from Egypt. So now the second commandment comes to elaborate more. You shouldn't say, for example, okay, I believe in God, the God of Israel, but I believe also in other gods. Like you'll be surprised to hear, in all the generations, people were like this. They believed in different gods. So God says, no. I am God who took you out from Egypt, and I am the only God. And you should not refer to any God, which I will explain how, in the presence of God. In my presence, you should not even refer to any other God. So what does it mean? That when it's not in His presence, I can? Is it possible that a person can say, not in the presence of God? I'm asking you. Can one say, now that God is not here, I can talk freely? Can one say that? It's impossible. Because God's presence is everywhere. He fills up all space. Which means this commandment which tells me you should not have any other God in His presence, it means you should never have any other God at all, because it's always in presence of God. Wherever you go, God goes with you. And He stays with the others at the same time. You understand? Because he fills up every space in the air of the world, in the atmosphere of the world. God is everywhere. So that was only a poetical expression by the Torah to tell me you should not have other gods in his presence. But the real explanation is, why shouldn't you have any other God? Because you should remember his presence. He's looking. How can you have any belief in anything? In contemporary verbalization, we can say that today there are modern ways how to believe in other things, while at the same time you think that you believe in God. But you allow yourself also to believe in some superstitions, in amulets, in all kinds of things that come from other nations. You are a person who believes in everything. Some people believe in everything. They don't want to take any chances, so to speak. They don't care about taking any chances, so they prefer to adopt everyone. By the way, we used to have a king of Israel, one of the kings of Israel, of the ancient kings of Israel. His name was Achaz. He was one of the bad kings. And Achaz used to believe also in the Torah, but he had a special closet in which he kept, in the Aron HaKodesh, the holy sanctuary, and in which he kept the tablets of the Torah of Moses, as well as other idols. He had other idols. Because in those times, the world was permeated with avodah zarah, with idol worshipping. Let us talk about the history of idol worshipping. Because that's the meaning of this commandment. You should not, the Torah severely, as you are going to see later in the words of the same paragraph, severely and with tremendous strictness refers to this commandment, that people should believe only in God and don't make any concession on that. You shouldn't say, yes, I believe in God, but I believe also in other things. We believe in nothing but Hashem. Only Hashem. And that's all. Of course, regulations must be followed. Circumstances must be taken and considered. But if you believe in anything, that is only God. Hashem Elokei Israel. No one else. And why do we have to have such a special commandment? Do we have today such a thing? I mean, at least for today, or in the past 2,000 years, not many nations have worshipped idols. It's already about close to 2,000 years when people in the world stopped worshipping all kinds of idols. Before that, even up to the time of Rome, there were pagans. The pagans, since time immemorial, people who believed in many kinds of powers, of sources of energy. Anything that provided them, for example, with anything in their interest, was considered a god. Water was considered a god. In Egypt, they worshipped the water. Pharaoh himself considered himself to be a god. And he used to go every morning very early to the Nile. That's where he did it. And see, this way people will consider him as a god. But one of the gods of Egypt was the water of the Nile. Why? Because they had always anything that they needed without having to ask for any rain. Egypt was blessed with the Niles, and they had total, everything, the lands were fertile, and there was no problem, even though there was no rain. Why? It was fertilized by the Niles, by nature. So they consider that a power, and that's power, that's a god. The sun was very, very important, no question about it. In fact, in old Egyptian language, it was called as Ra. That's the sun. Ra. In Hebrew, it would be Ra, which means bad. But in Egyptian, that was one of the greatest gods that they had, the god that is the sun. And they would tell you, why not? I mean, the sun is such a power. Without the sun, who can survive? You'll become, if the sun would go further, just a few kilometers away, you would become an ice cube. Or if it is closer, he would burn up. And yet at the same time, we know that the sun is the source of many, many, many sources of good health. Now the sun, people go to the sun to get healthier, to feel better. No question about it. Huh?
Vitamin D.
That's right. Vitamin D, 20 minutes a day at least. You should have some kinds of light from the sun. If you stay home all the time without the sun, you might get sick. So the sun is a tremendous source of power. So they refer to it as a god. And soon I will tell you how did they come to that. But people worshipped anything. They worshipped even people. Nebuchadnezzar, for example, the one who destroyed our temple, the first one, he considered himself a god. He dictated to his people to worship him every day. When they found out that Daniel, who was a Jew of course, and he was a very prominent man in the government of Nebuchadnezzar, when they went to the king and they said to him, Daniel does not pray to you, he prays to the God of Israel, you know what happened? They threw him in the pit of lions. And a miracle happened and the lions did not kill him. And then the king, who loved very much Daniel, he said, you see, you wanted him to be killed and you persecuted him by doing this, now you have to pay. You also jump into the lions and let's see if they are not hungry. And as soon as they went, those who were harassing Daniel, they went into the pit and they were consumed by the lions in a minute. They were eaten alive. But at the same time, we should not forget that Nebuchadnezzar imposed upon his people to worship him as a god. Why? Because he was the biggest conqueror in the world. So little by little it went to his mind. And now he thinks he's a god. So to have an idea as to what is a god was not difficult in those days. Anything that provided you with something becomes a god. But you have to understand that in the very beginning of time, that did not happen as I said now. After God created the world, and after the story of Adam and Chava and Noah, there was a time that was known as Dor Enosh. One of the grandchildren of Adam, Enosh. That was known as the generation of Enosh. What happened then? The people realized then, because until then they knew that only God, the creator of heavens and earth, they were very close to God. They knew better than anyone that there is a God who created the world. But little by little they started to look at the servants of God, the sun, the moon. And they said, what are these? These are great powers. And these are the servants of God. We owe them also a certain service. We have to glorify them. As it is important when you have a king, he has his ministers, you have to give respect also to his ministers. You cannot ignore the ministers and just because they were appointed by God himself, by the king himself. So that's the same way they looked upon nature. They looked upon the sun as the servant of God. If he is the servant of God, we owe it tremendous honor. So they started to develop prayers to the sun as a servant of God. So far, nothing terrible. To the moon, the same thing. To the water, the same thing. To all kinds of sources of energy that we had in the world, they worship them as servants of God. Little by little, the tradition to build temples, to consecrate those servants, started to spread. And new people who became, they became high priests. And the high priest convinced the people to come and worship the servant of God. Alright? This temple is for the sun. This temple is for the moon. This temple is for this animal. And so forth and so forth. And people would come and bring gifts to the temples, all in the name of that servant. You see, we could always, God forbid, I can just bring some kind of equity with, to make an equation between that and the fact that we realize that God, there is God, and He has myriads of angels. So when we look upon the angels, the Kabbalists, for example, they refer to the angels, each one according to the power that is attributed to him. There is the power of Malach Gabriel or Malach Raphael, the angel Raphael. So some people might think that this is the same thing. Like the old time. In the old time they used to refer to the servants of God as the powers of nature, those that served the nature in this world, and that's how they turned to them to glorify them and sanctify them. It didn't take much time until this service for the servant of God, people forgot that they are in fact praying to the servant of God, and now they don't refer anymore to them as the servants of God, but each one of them is a God. Each one of them is a God who takes care, the God of the sun, the God of the moon, which means each one requires a source of energy, and that source of energy is another God. Everything that I am saying here to you is written in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, in the Rambam, Maimonides, in the first paragraph. It's a long paragraph of the first chapter of the laws of Avodah Zarah. He tells us exactly the history of how Avodah Zarah, idol worshipping, developed in the world. That was known as, and in the generation of Enosh, all the generation was permeated with Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah became the most important things in their life, idol worshipping. Because also, you have to understand, they did not just worship. Every worship with every worship they developed also certain services that had to do with distractions, such as divertissements, such as dancing, food. They used to have all kinds of services in association with all kinds of the amusements that the people love to do. Even some things that I would feel embarrassed to even mention. Some of the idol worshipping require things that we know that they are considered an abomination in sexual things, and they used to associate this with that, and that's how they used to perform those services to those Avodah Zarah. It became worse and worse. And people were very much interested because that practically gave them a sense in their life. You know, even though it required from them to go to the temples and to give donations and to give donation to this temple and to go to this donation and to this temple. You know, like the Greek civilization, for example. They had the God for everything.